everyone, my name is Michaela. Welcome to Jerry's Live Workshops. This week, or this month, we are working on combining soft pastels and oil pastels. So I'm gonna go ahead and dive in, but if you have any questions throughout the live demo, please put it in the chat and my lovely moderator, Amanda, will ask them live for you guys so I can answer all those questions. And if you want to see any of the materials that I'm using, there is a code JLW7. If you type that in the JerrysArtarama website, it will pop up everything that I'm using tonight. But let's go ahead and dive right in. So starting off, these are the materials that I'm working with tonight. I have a set of 72 colors in oil pastels. I have some Woodless pastel pencils, set of 48. And then I also have some super soft handmade pastel blocks. I'm going to use all three of these in the same piece. Now, before I start applying these materials to paper, I do kind of want to tell you the difference between these three and how to use these three, and then I'll show you how to use them together. Now, to start off, oil pastels. Oil pastels are going to be very creamy. They're going to have a very soft kind of like lipsticky texture. And they are the type of oil the oil that's in here, that's the type of oil that does not dry. So you have to keep that in mind when you're finishing off your piece, either choosing the correct varnish or fixative, or framing it in a frame behind glass, making sure there's a separation between your piece and the glass. Next, we have soft pastels. And I have two different kinds here. This one up top, these are the Woodless pastel pencils. These are just full sticks of soft pastel. It's not super soft, I guess, in comparison to this one. So I'm gonna say this is maybe semi-hard. So it's gonna lay down just a little bit differently. It's going to have a lot sharper lines, and it's going to be a little bit softer once you place it down on the paper, if that makes sense. The coverage will be a little bit softer. And then lastly, we have these handmade soft pastel blocks. These are gonna be super duper soft, where you can just kind of wipe off the pigment with your finger and it's going to show up on your hand. These are going to be really great because the blocks are fairly large for placing down large areas of color. And they're just very, very strong when it comes to laying down this pigment. But with that, let's talk about combining these three, because typically you don't see a lot of art with these two combined, and I'm going to tell you why. When you have soft pastel, this is a dry pigment sitting on a surface of a piece of paper, where oil pastel has that oil in it. So usually when those two combine, the soft pastel pigment is going to kind of soak up the oil from the oil pastel. So you need to follow either like a proper order or keep them separated on your piece. But as long as you know that, you can kind of work with it. So let's get started. I am going to start by blocking in everything with my soft pastels because I just want to make sure I have color everywhere before I start getting into those nitty-gritty details. So I'm working on pastel mat for this. The reason I chose this is because it has a really nice kind of sandpapery texture, which is great for the soft pastel. But since it's got such a rough texture, you can put a nice thin layer of soft pastel and still have that texture available for when you add that oil pastel. So I think this is a really good surface to work with when you're combining these two. Now you can use other pastel papers, but if you are using a pastel paper with less texture, you're going to want to make sure that those two are almost fully separated, or make sure your soft pastel layers are really thin. But I think this is a really good go-to for this particular project. And I chose number 5. These come in different sets of different colors. I just really like the blues and greens in here. It's got a nice deep green, a nice deep blue, a white, and then the color that I'm using for this project, which is this really pretty kind of sea foamy color here. And each sheet of pastel mat comes with this layer of glycine, which I like to keep attached while I'm working because I'm going to be using this in my actual process, as well as keeping it protected while I'm working on it and afterwards. So let me show you my reference photo. Now, originally when I was looking for a reference photo, I did go to unsplash.com, which is where I usually go to find my reference photos. And I found this guy, which is a beautifully saturated seagull on the beach. I just really liked seeing the colors in here, like those greens, blues, purples, and oranges. But then I was like, I really want to use one of my own photos, because if you know me, if you've seen me in some of my other Jerry's Lives or other shorts, I have a small obsession with birds, just a little one. So I have a lot of bird pictures on my phone. So I was like, I'll have no problem finding something else. I really thought I would have a seagull similar to this in my photo reel, and I did not. However, I think I found something better. You can probably see right next to me here the finished piece. I had this really beautiful picture of this pelican on the beach from when I was living in Florida. I don't know what his deal was, but he became my best friend. I got super close with him. I just sat on the beach and hung out with him while my grandpa was fishing on the ocean. But I just really love this picture. I've actually painted him before in acrylic, using very similar colors that I'm going to be using tonight. Now, I wanted to replicate the vibrancy of this picture with the seagull, so I just upped the saturation by a lot. And I got this really beautiful color scheme. I didn't have to adjust anything. These were just the already underlying colors in this picture. So I really enjoy the blues and those greens, a little bit of purple, orange, and blue. I think it's really beautiful. I didn't have to do anything beyond adjusting the saturation for this. And I do think that especially looking at these two. This already looks black and white next to this now. I find it a lot easier working from a reference photo that I up the saturation on than working on the original reference photo, because I can neutralize my colors however I like. And I already know the base vibrant color I can work with on this, where this I have to search for those vibrant underlying colors in this picture. So if you really like adding punchy colors to your work, I definitely suggest a highly saturated reference photo. So what I did is from here, I transferred it onto my pastel mat using the Sorol white transfer paper, which ends up looking almost exactly like if I were to be using the white Woodless pastel pencil from the Woodless pastel set. So you can either sketch your image on that way, or using this, it's going to look and feel about the same. Now from here, I also really like having a border to hold on to while I'm working. So that's why I have some tape. I'm going to tape off my edges, and I really like this because this is a 1/4 inch, so it has a really small surface area, but once you pull it off, it does create a really nice border of that original paper color on there. So let's go ahead and tape this off, and then we can get started. And then if you have any questions for me, pop that in the chat, and I'll be more than happy to try and answer those. And when I lay tape, I line up the corners, and then I make sure that the center is where it needs to go, and I flatten it down. And I don't normally use such a small border, but since I'm working on something a little bit smaller in scale, this is a 9.5 by 12. I don't want the border to overtake my image. So since I'm working a little bit smaller, I want that smaller border. And then the last thing I do with the tape is once it's all down, I will make sure I crease those areas where they overlap to make sure I don't have any pigment lying underneath, or getting underneath, I should say. So what I mean by that is I will go in here, which you might be able to get a better view of this. I literally just take my nail, and right where they overlap, I make sure that that's kind of pressed down so that nothing gets in that little gap there. And I do that on every corner, where I just take my nail and I kind of press that down. That way I don't have to worry about getting a little bit of a powder line in those corners. I think it's just like a really nice extra little step. I also like to trim off the excess little tails, just so that I don't have my paper constantly sticking to the surface or getting caught in my glycine. So again, I'll just use my nail to hold it in place along that edge and tear off those little tails. Now I'm going to start, like I said, with those handmade soft pastel blocks to block in my background and my sand. And I'm gonna make sure that since these are super soft, that I add them in a really thin layer. Because if I add these down and, let me flip this over, it's really thick and powdery, even if I fix it with a fixative, it's only going to fix that top layer and there's still gonna be some loose powder underneath. And once you add either the woodless pastels or the oil pastels, it's just going to break through and it's not going to adhere to the surface. So for this step, I'm actually gonna take off this paper. I'm starting with this really pretty sky blue color. I'm just going to gently drag it across the surface and slowly build it up. I also have some transition brushes. This one is a number 4. I did add a set with a variety of sizes and types. I just like a big fluffy one so I can start blending it into the surface. Like I said, I don't want a lot of loose pigment on here for these next steps. So I'm just going in a circular motion, packing it into those crevices in the paper and brushing off any excess. And then that's when I can start going in and adding more of that to solidify that color. And again, you can see how much pigment is coming off there. I want to make sure it's fully covered, but I also don't want to have a lot of excess pigment on there. I'm actually going to knock this off in my trash can. I do catch myself doing this sometimes, which you definitely should not do, but don't blow the powder off of your piece, because that's just going to scatter it into the air and you don't want to be breathing pigment in. So I usually recommend you not to do that. So knock it off into your trash can or dust it off on the surface of your desk. And I'm not too worried about covering my pelican. I'd much rather have a smooth background where I cover up part of my drawing than work around it and then have a weird halo of that original color. So again, I'm just gonna lightly dust this into the surface. I don't really need full coverage in the water like I did in the sky, because I know I'm gonna be adding more colors and layers to this section, and I kind of like a little bit of variation to make it feel like water in that area. It also helps me separate the sky from the water. And then let me make sure I fix up this edge because I have this taped off. I want to make sure it continues all the way to that edge. Just very lightly brushing it into those open areas and dusting it away. All right, so that's all I'm gonna do for this top section, and then I'll add in more with those woodless pastel pencils. I'm now gonna move down into my sand. You can kind of see I made a little thumbprint on there, and to fix that, I'm not too worried about it. I have a kneaded eraser. Of course, I could just blend it in with the next color, but there might be a weird variation of color in that area. So just to be safe, I'm both cleaning off my gloves and kneading this. And all I really have to do is first tap off any loose pigment, and then you can rub out anything that got stuck into the surface. And now I'm ready for the sand color, which I have this really pretty kind of yellow ochre color. Again, I'm going to take off the label here so it doesn't get in the way. And again, I'm going to start by just lightly blocking in where the sand is going to go. Now you can see up in here that there is a little bit of an overlap of the blues and purples of the water and the sand color. So what I'm going to do for that area is kind of figure out where my drawing is, and I'm not even putting any pressure. I'm just running this over the surface to get a little bit of a combination of colors there. I'm going to continue laying down the sand color, making sure I don't forget in between his feet there. And then same thing, dusting it into the surface of the paper, just knocking out any of that blue pigment, moving in a circular motion. I am letting it overlap that blue just a touch so there's not a harsh line there. And at this point, it's kind of up to the artist on whether you like the variation of this single layer or if you want to go back in and make sure it's a little bit more solid. Which I think I'm going to go back in. I might leave this top section because it's further away. I want a little bit of variation still. But closer up, I'm going to make sure that this is filled in really nicely. And then that's all I'm going to do for this first layer. I just wanted to make sure that I have the large areas filled in really quickly, and I don't have to worry about any line work when using the Woodless pastel pencils. With this, it lays down super smooth and evenly. So that makes this first step really quick and easy. Let's tap off the picture. And then I can finish off with these big chunky boys. Got a little bit of pigment on there. All right, so now I'm gonna move into those Woodless pastel pencils. So these are going to be just a little bit harder than the blocks, and they're going to be a lot more precise. So I think I'm going to start by solidifying where my horizon line is, and I want to use a lighter blue, but something darker than what I already have put down there. Let me grab a straightish edge. I think this is the only straight line I really want on here. I can always kind of naturalize that straight line later, but I just like having a nice crisp line to separate the sky from the water. Now from there, I can start blocking in those waves and the variation in the water. I like to kind of blend down this color just a little bit, either up into the sky or down into the water, to help create more of that separation. And I have, actually, I'll use the same one to start blocking in a little bit of this cloud shape up in the sky, because it's not all this beautiful, pretty light blue. it's got those kind of stormy clouds in the distance. So I'm just going to very lightly start blocking in a cloud shape. I'm just moving my pencil in kind of these long circles, going back, overlapping a little bit, and trying to make a form that feels like a cloud. Now if you start doing this and the lines are too stark, like right now mine feel a little bit heavy, that's what that transition brush is going to be great for. So let's say I think that's a little too scratchy and a little bit darker than I intended. I can easily just grab this guy and follow it along the horizon line and brush it into the surface. That's going to help soften those lines and that color a little bit. Make it feel a little bit more subtle. So now I can go back in and build up a little bit more. I like at least 3 scales of value in each item or piece or subject matter. So with these clouds, I have the lightness of the sky. Maybe the lightest color is going to be a white, and then I have this guy. So I have the 3, but I'm kind of wanting a little bit more. And that's kind of chosen by taste and by piece and how things look. Again, I'm just going to lightly dust this into the surface, make it feel a little softer, and then I'll tap off the excess. Now what's great with these soft pastels is you can get really beautiful, soft, light color. Now keep in mind, if you are spray fixing this, which you will be if you are combining these 2 types of pastels, that all the colors you're laying down are going to get just a smidge darker. Now, as long as it's applied evenly, it will all appear evenly slightly darker. You want to be careful with splattering when it comes to fixative, because then you will get little spots on your piece. I did have that happen in one of my previous practices of this, and the way it did that on the sand, I was like, wait, I actually kind of like this. So what's really great about finding mistakes in art is you can apply it once you figure out how it works. So even though you want to avoid the splatters when it comes to adding fixative, I was using a workable fixative from Krylon rather than this really nice Sennelier pastel fixative. It left a little bit of a speckle across my entire piece, but it made the sand look really realistic and nice. So if I wanted to, I could block off the water here and purposefully spray that fixative onto just the sand and get a nice texture, because I'm using it on purpose. I've found what that mistake was, how it worked, and now I can apply it to my piece knowing what it's going to do. So I'm going to add some clouds up in the sky as well. Let's see. There's not a lot of white, so I'm going to do very light layers of this, just like I did with that darker purple. Same ovally texture. To block it in. Maybe there's a little bit of white coming in here. And it's already giving this cloud a little bit more shape. And I think I need a little bit of a dark cloud up here. I like that little pop of darkness up there. And then right underneath it, add that bright white, which you can see. Let me pull it down. This little guy up in here. I just really like that. Now over here, I have just a couple wispy, soft clouds. So I'm just going to lightly block it in where I want it. And then those darker areas I can go in and actually press down to create those brighter areas. Then maybe I just want this whole side to be just a little bit lighter. Need just a little something over here. All right. And that's really nice. It's very subtle, but you can definitely tell something's happening back there. It is far away, so I don't want a ton of detail and emphasis back there. So I think that's perfect. And as you can see, I'm just continually tapping off any excess. That's definitely going to help in those later stages when I add the oil pastel. All right, let's work on the water. I'm going to use the same color to start, I think, just to help me block in what's happening. So I have my waves starting over here. I can even use this to help me figure out where my pelican head went. Now I can work around that a little bit. This wave over here is actually really dark, so let me add just a little bit more of that over there. And you can also see in the reference photo that this whole strip up here is pretty green, and then everything below is blues and purples. So I'm going to create that same separation, I believe. Let me finish figuring out where these waves are real quick. And then I'm going to go in with these two colors. Now, what I like about these pencils is you can kind of tell what it's going to look like when you spray fix it to an extent, just because when they added the resin handles, the pigment got a little bit wet, so that's kind of what it's going to look like. This one I think is a little exaggerated. I think it's going to look a little bit more like the actual pigment here. But I'm going to fill in this entire top area with these really pretty greens. And you can tell I like this color because he's been run down to a little bit of a nub. And then over on the right hand side, there's a little bit more darkness. So I think that's where I'm going to be using this guy. I'm going to block in those dark areas. I can always bring in a darker green, but I like to start light. And then it gets a little bit dark as it creates a wave behind those really bright white waves. All right, I think, because it gets kind of like a yellowy green mixed with a blue, I'm not fully sure what color that is. I think I'm going to go for this more neutralized dark green. But if you ever run into this same issue, I do recommend creating these little viewfinders. They're literally just pieces of scrap paper with either a square or a circle, just a little view cut out in the center, surrounded by white. So I can just lay this down and isolate that color and figure out what that is. So now I can lay down the colors that I'm kind of deciding on and figure out which one is going to do the best job. And I think I was right in choosing this one. It's a little off, but I'm only going to be using a little bit of it. Ignore the handle. Imagine just just the point. All right. Let me get those out of the way. Oh, and there I did it again. I added a little fingerprint on the edge there, which, like I said, I'm not going to freak out about it. I'm going to try and erase it and build up that color again. Tap off the excess first. And I think that's all I had to do. There's a little bit of that brown still there, but I haven't worked up that area with the other colors, so I think that should be fine. Let me go in with that dark green and build up the top of those waves. This is the shadow that's right underneath the white crests. Is that what they are? The little foamy bits of the wave. Just going to dust this into the surface. And the reason soft pastel is so great for the background is because it's far away, it's soft, and it's not super detailed. So that's why I'm putting most of the soft pastels back there. And I haven't even touched my pelican because I want this to be mostly oil pastel. The oil pastel is going to be a lot punchier. It's also going to have a little bit more of a presence because it's going to lift up off the surface. It's going to have more physical texture to it. So if you add any of that to the background, it's going to draw your eye there. It's going to feel a little out of place. So in this particular piece, the oil pastel is going to focus from here down and mostly just in the pelican. Add a little bit more of this darker green, maybe a couple loose lines back here and over here. All right. And then there are also just a few spots of like this lighter blue. So I'll probably go in and do the same thing I just did, adding a couple streaks of variation back there. The waves are so small back there that you don't really get to see how they are formed, but you can definitely see a switch in value. So I think that's a really quick and easy step for that. Dusting off the excess. Now let's keep moving forward. I have the blues and purples. This is my favorite section of this piece. The blues and purples in this section are just so pretty. I have this really light kind of like lavendery purple. I have that kind of periwinkle I was working with. I think I might also use this purple for like this area where it hits the sand. And it's lighter than it appears. And remember, ignore the handle, think more of just the point. That's the color I'm aiming for. And then I think I need to add that white for the contrast in there. All right, now let me block in where those waves are first, just so I can figure out where things are again. I have this really cool little area right here. Another wave happening right around here. I'm just being pretty loose with this area. Perfect. That little fix I worked on is covered with white, which is perfect. There's a little bit of white coming through over here. And then of course, these big waves. Now this is a fun thing that I do. When it comes to something out of the distance, kind of crazy in texture, this is where I love to scribble. So I might grab, I have two whites in this set, which I love. This one I keep a little bit of a point on. The other one I wear down to a nub. This one is great for the scribbling. So what I'm really gonna do is I'm just going to move my hand along this line where I have those waves. I'm only gonna be looking at my reference photo, and I'm gonna kind of let my hand squiggle and match the thickness of the waves as I go. I hope that makes sense, but this is what I mean. My eye is only on my reference photo. I keep switching back, making sure I'm still on that line, but I'm mostly just scribbling and following the thickness in the direction of those waves. And since it's so far away, they look like waves. Again, I'm going to continue up here. There's a big kind of splashing wave, so I can get kind of crazy with my squiggling in this area. I'm twisting it in my hand, letting it kind of do whatever it wants to do. As long as I'm following that proper line of where it's at, that's all I really need. All right, and then I have that really nice wave going across the entire thing. This is where I can go in and fix things. I want to make sure the bottom of that wave line is kind of softened with a little bit of a gradient and a straight line along the bottom. Now I can add a little bit more to these other areas where I have those distinct bright areas. All right, and now I know where things are, and I can work around those and add in these darker colors. So now that I know where those waves are, I can find those areas of shadow by just coloring underneath that white line. And that's a little dark and it needs some green, but it's definitely working out. All right, so I'm going to go back in with that green I was using because I'm noticing that some of those shadows are not that purpley color. I'm going to go in and layer it with that green. Give it a little bit more dimension. And then this whole guy is pretty dark green back here. All right, and now I have a really nice wave going through the entire thing here. I might go back into the background and where I created those dark green areas, allow some of the white to kind of cross over that darkness. Got a really nice wave over here, just a little scribble line. And then there are some off in the distance. I'm just going to lightly pencil that in back there. All right. And now I can focus on this front area of the water, which I'm going to focus on these purples, I think. So blocking in, I might even have just some of this to help me start blending it down. There's a little bit of this green where it starts hitting the sand. It goes from like a green into a purple, which is interesting. Then this area gets kind of dark on the other side of that bright white. And again, it gets kind of green where it hits the sand. So I'm going to have, oop, wrong color. Have some of that in there as well and let it overlap and mix into a new color. This area is also kind of green. And I do want to use that green, but I don't want it to look like the same green I have in the background, which is why I like it mixed with this periwinkle color. All right, block in more of this water here. This whole area is kind of that periwinkle color. All right, go back in with this soft purple to blend everything together. And this is where I can grab that really nice vibrant purple. And I like this right in here where that warm sand color is introduced. And it makes it feel kind of wet, where it's got the subtle blues of the water mixed with the warmth of the sand. And I can get that in everywhere where it's starting to touch the sand. There's some going up in here a little bit, and just a little bit over here. All right. And then with that, I feel like the water is looking like water. It's looking really nice. I do want to make sure I don't have any loose pigment on there, so I'm not going to brush it off because I like the intensity of the marks I made, but I am going to tap it off into my trash can. All right, so from here, I'm moving into the sand. Now this is where it gets kind of fun. To start off, I want to add a little bit of variation to the sand color. Now if you look at my reference photo here, let me make sure there's not a glare on it. It's not all one color. Of course there's the shadow under his butt there, but it looks like it gets kind of cooler up on top as it gets closer to the water. And I think using that purple to cool down the warmth of the sand in that area is both going to tie to the colors in the water and create a really nice subtle coolness to that area. So using that same purple I was using in the water, I'm going to start dusting this in lightly back here. And you can see it's kind of changing the sand, maybe pushing it back a little bit. I'm making sure that I'm moving this horizontally following the horizon line so that if I do get any lines as I'm doing this, they make sense in the perspective of the drawing. And I'm not going to bring it all the way down to the foreground because the foreground feels a lot warmer than what's receding back in space. So I'm just going to be doing this top half that's further away, and then maybe bring it down over here where the water is hitting the sand. All right. And now I'm just going to soften that by brushing it in using my transition brush. Again, doing the same thing, following the horizon line angle as I brush this. If I want to disrupt any lines or like blocks of color, I can go in, do the opposite direction to kind of move that pigment around, and then go back to blending it that way. All right. Now, the fun part I was talking about, how do you create sand without having to add every single little granule into the foreground? What you're going to do is you're going to be using the same material, the Woodless pastel pencils, which let me kind of put these out of the way. And you're going to find about 5 colors that you spot in the sand. So I see this kind of light yellowy color, maybe even like this really light beige. And then I also see some really vibrant oranges in the sand. So I'm going to grab 2 different oranges. So that's 4. I need at least 1 more color. I do see some really dark spots in here. So I'm going to grab maybe this warm dark brown. I might grab one more. I think I need one more. I think I'm gonna go for something in between that and my darkest orange to round out the colors in the sand. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take an X-Acto blade, or not an X-Acto blade, this is an accurate blade actually. A sharp blade, push this out of the way. And what I'm gonna do, let me pick one that is obvious. We'll start with that dark brown. Is I'm going to shave off some powder from the point of my pencil onto the surface. Now, two things to keep in mind are the distance. The closer you are, the more clumped your powder is going to be, and then the farther away you are, the more it's going to spread out. Now, keep in mind, the further away you go, the more that powder is going to spread. So you want to make sure you don't go too high to the point where it's getting into where you're potentially breathing it in, and not too close where you're just getting big clumps of powder. So I like to go maybe 2 inches above the surface here, and I'm just running this along the point, and I see a little bit of pigment fall. Are you guys able to see that? Sweet. And I will just slowly do that. I don't need a lot of this dark color. Slowly do that and move this as I go. I hope this isn't like a terrible, awful noise. Is this a terrible noise? Okay. And I'm just going back and forth. Since the granules are obvious in the foreground and not so much in the background, I want to make sure I create a line across the sand where I feel like that detail is no longer visible. So I'm only doing this lower portion of the sand, not entering where I added that really nice purple. And the more I move around, like lifting, lowering, back and forth, the more I do that, the more variation those speckles are going to be. Now, if you get in an area that you don't want it to go, you can use 2 different tools for this. You can either use that transition brush to dust it out of the way, but you might risk it going into the surface. You can also use one of these color shifters to kind of move that pigment off of where you want it to go. I have a big area right here. There we go. So now I'm going to go into the rest of my colors. I have this really nice, like dark orangey color, which is slightly more saturated than what I already have down there. This one I might be able to go a little bit further into the background without it being distracting detail. What's nice about this is not only are you adding a really nice technique and texture to your surface, you're also sharpening your pencils as you go. You have a question?
Yeah, we're pretty obsessed with this move of sharpening your pencil onto your paper. And we were wondering if when you get it all laid the way you like it, can you either hold it up or get Ming to zoom in so that we can see it a little better?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Now, of course, as you are doing this on the surface, it's not going to automatically adhere to your paper. So once I have all of this laid down where I want it and dusting away any areas I don't want it to go, I'm going to pull out that glassine sheet that I have folded under. I'm going to lay it over the entire thing, and I'm going to press it down into the paper so that when I pick it up, that really nice, beautiful texture that you laid out stays right where you placed it. All right, I got 2 more colors. I really like when I add these lighter colors in. I feel like that's when it starts to feel like sand. And I think I used a slightly different combination of colors on my finished piece right to my side here. So I'll show you both this one and my other one. Let's add a little bit of this last color. Okay. So now I'm going to very carefully pull out my glassine sheet. Before I press anything down, I'm going to make sure I don't have any sand speckles anywhere I don't want it to be. So I have a little bit in my water. I'm just going to dust it off of my water area. I'm not too worried about it being on the Pelican actually. So now I can grab that sheet of glassine, line it up perfectly on the surface. And this is where I'm just going to press down on the surface. You can use a brayer, your hands, a Woodless pastel pencil, and just make sure that you press down hard enough. I would use my gloves, but they're getting stuck on the glassine. Just making sure you press it down into the surface. Alright, I'm going to remove that glassine, knock off any excess in the trash can, and then I'll show you up close. Alright, let's take a look. Do we want to cut it this way? Alright, and then now you can see that really beautiful sandy texture. It only stays in the foreground. It kind of blends away back into space. And I tapped this off already, so this is adhered to the surface. Now I said I used slightly different colors on this other guy here. I'm gonna try and not get him dirty. This is the other finished piece I worked on, and that's the sand that turned out there. Slightly different variation of colors, but it's still a really beautiful sandy texture. Oh, okay. Now I need one more thing in the sand, and that is the shadow where his butt is creating a little bit of a soft shadow, and it gets kind of like a stark shadow as it gets to the feathers that are close to the ground. So if you don't know, shadows, the closer the object is to the surface, the starker that shadow. The further away it is from the surface, the softer the shadow. So let me find, I'll probably use one of these, and I'll find where that little shape is, right there. I'm very lightly blocking it in. And I'm slowly lifting up my pencil as I pull away so it gets softer. And then make sure it gets dark under here. Now I want to be careful when I'm blending this section in. I think originally I did this before adding that really beautiful sand texture. So I'm either going to have to be very purposeful with my line work and make sure it kind of disappears, or blend it in and reapply the sand. You can kind of pick and choose how you want to do that. I do recommend doing this before the sand, but if you're following along and already did that, that's okay. I'll walk you through what I end up doing. Making sure I add a little bit of this under the edges of his feet as well, because the shadow isn't very obvious, but there's still going to be a little bit of something there, and it helps ground him a little bit. So I'm doing a little bit of cross hatching to kind of help this blend in without it looking like I drew it on. Do we have another question?
Yes. Someone was wondering if you invented the pencil shaving technique.
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's called pastel dusting. I don't know if people have done it this way where you're shaving it off of a pencil. I think typically people take a soft pastel, create a pile of shavings, and then sprinkle it on that way. But I did not invent the pastel dusting. I'm going to see if I can very lightly, actually, instead of using the transition brush, I also have these Creative Mark blending stumps. They're size 2, so they're super teeny tiny. And to help preserve some of that really nice sand texture, I'm going to kind of scumble in the blending this way instead of obliterating that really nice texture with my transition brush. So I'm just making sure it's packed into the surface. I'm just kind of tapping it into place, softly blending those edges. And then I'll dust off the surface, and then I think that's all I'm going to do for this main soft pastel layer, besides blocking in some base colors in my Pelican. So let me tap that off. All right. Now I said mostly the Pelican is going to be oil pastel, but if I have anything poking through, I don't know if I want it to be this green color. So I'm going to block it in all mostly one color. I have this really nice deep red. I'm just going to use this to reaffirm my sketch and where his shape is taking place. And making sure that if there is a color peeking through, it's kind of a fun color that matches him. So I'm working around where my sketch is, making sure I still have those separations where I have his wing, his back, his chest, and then also where I have those really nice highlights and separations in those areas. And then once I finish this, I'm going to take a 5-minute break. I'm going to spray fix this and take a step outside. You guys are welcome to take a break as well. And then when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about how these two different types of pastels layer, and we'll do the final layer of oil pastel. Alright, now he's got a little bit of this color in his beak, so I might as well start adding that in there. I'm going to do a different color for his chest. And another thing to keep in mind for this step, when it comes to oil pastels, you can use a technique called sgraffito, which if you don't know what sgraffito is, it basically means you apply a layer of oil pastel and then you can use something to scrape back the surface and it will show you what's underneath, which is important because when you're working on this step, if you want to use sgraffito on this piece, you want to make sure that the color you're laying down for this step is going to be something contrasting what you're putting on top. So even though this is kind of a dark tan on him here, I do want to try and use sgraffito technique on his chest, and hopefully this lighter color will be what pokes through. Just going to add a little bit on that highlight there. I don't need to get crazy. Now the last color I'm going to use is this really pretty dark blue, because in the original photo it is like a dark black or brown, but when I punched up that saturation it turned blue, which I find really pretty. And I'm overlapping that really pretty red I put in there, just so that it's different from the red I put everywhere else. And then of course, need to fill in his feet, which is really funny. When I was working on changing the saturation of this picture, I had this version on my screen, and Emmy, the other resident artist, saw it and she was like, "Is that a blue-footed booby?" And I'm like, "No, close." He does have blue feet right now. All right, and then just another heads up, I did say I was going to spray fix this, which I am, but keep in mind that you want to allow some dry time for fixative before you work on it. So because of that and our time constraint for this show, I do have a very similar piece of like this that I prepared that I will be swapping out for you guys, so we can jump straight back in after our break. Right, and then the last step is just making sure that's in the surface of the paper. So I'm going in with that blending stump and just making sure it is adhered without any loose pigment. And I know it looks funny, but like I said, we're adding a lot of oil pastel to this figure, so I'm not too worried as long as it's mostly all one color. I'm not too worried. All right. Do we have another question?
We have one last one before we take a break.
Mm-hmm.
One of our viewers said, "I see that you're wearing gloves. I've spent the last 2 to 3 days watching a friend create a large portrait piece with soft pastels. She didn't wear gloves and her fingers look like Cheeto dust. Should she have worn gloves?"
Yes. I always recommend wearing gloves when you work with pastels of any kind, just because it's either going to be soft pastel with a lot of loose pigment that gets everywhere. A good example is Emmy has been working on a pastel piece, and she actually dyed the ends of her hair with the pigment powder. So you just got to be extra careful because it's a lot of loose pigment. Oil pastel is a little bit easier because it kind of all sticks together, but the ones I'm using are very lipsticky, and those can get kind of messy too. I just think it's good practice to keep your hands clean, because if you suddenly need clean hands to pick up something, you can just easily pull off a glove and reapply one. I don't know, I just think it's good practice. All right, this is our stopping point. We're going to take a nice 5-minute break, grab some water, go to the restroom. I'm gonna get this sprayed, and then we'll come back and add some oil pastel. See you in 5. Hello and welcome back. All right. So we're going to start working into our oil pastel. Now, this is my fixed version. Now that I'm looking at it, I kind of wish I did more with it before I fixed it, but we're going to jump in with some oil pastel. I am keeping out the pastels that I have been using because you can sgraffito using those pastels. I will say that if you do that, you want to make sure that you clean off and shave off the point of that pencil, excuse me, so you don't get any oil contamination in a future project. Do we have a question already?
Yes. As we get started, Sue was wondering if there is any way that the oil pastel can be applied without using a fixative.
Let's take a look. I did a lot of testing and sometimes it would work, sometimes it would not. I do have this here, which this is, I have oil pastel on the bottom. This one is fixed, this one is not. Same thing up here, these are both soft pastel. This one is fixed, this one is not. So let's see, let's do a little experiment. So I have an oil pastel, let's focus on the top there. I can easily put this on here. It's adhering fairly well. I have a little bit of pigment pickup on my pastel. Now on this one, I have a feeling it's not going to adhere, it's not going to stick, and I'm going to get a lot of pigment on here. Let's see. So yes, I have quite a bit of pigment pickup and it's not adhering or sticking to the surface. So you can, however, it's not going to adhere very well and that exposed pigment is going to soak up the oil from your pastel and it's going to create kind of a darker halo, which you can use to your benefit, which I did on, let me wipe this off, on my finished piece here. I went back in my oil pastel phase and added more loose pastel up here and I didn't fix it. Then I added the white with oil pastel and it created a little bit of an oil bloom. However, it works because now it looks like that little area has a shadow. So as long as you are aware of that and you use it to your advantage, it can be a good technique, but be aware in case you are not wanting to do that, that fixing it will help minimize that. All right, let's do the same thing down here just since I have it. I didn't fully test this because I was always imagining that how would the soft pastel attach to such an oily surface? But let's test it. Let me use the blocks. And then I'll also use a pencil for this step. This really pretty purpley color. Let me take this off. All right, this side is fixed. I did not use the oil pastel fixative for this, so it might have a different outcome. There is a specific more vinyl-based resin in the oil pastel fixative in the same brand. So it looks like you can, if the layer is thin, so you can see the top of these squiggles is showing up more than the bottom because the bottom has a lot more of that oil pastel on there. It's not really adhering to the surface. And I imagine this side will be even worse. Let's test it out. It's about the same. A lot less down here in the thicker side. And you can see that it gets really dark as it mixes with that oil. So keeping those things in mind. Also, if you ever put soft pastel on top of oil pastel, please clean off your dry pastel. I like to just shave off that section with a blade so I don't contaminate future projects with having oil in my pastel. We have a question?
Yes, can you just remind us what the top row versus the bottom row are on this?
So this top row is soft pastel. The one on the left I sprayed with a fixative. The one on the right I didn't do anything to. This is just loose, unfixed pigment. Down here I did oil pastel first, and I fixed the one on the left, and then I put dry pastel on top. So you can see that when this touches the oil pastel, that soft pastel is going to get really dark, especially in this thicker area at the bottom. The top, that pink squiggle, is oil pastel on top of soft pastel. So it's going to look better if you do this top left. You start with your soft pastels, you spray fix it in place, making sure that you have mostly thin layers to medium layers, and then go on top with oil pastel. Of course, you can do another variation. Just keep in mind what those outcomes are going to be. The soft pastel is going to darken when it comes in contact with that oil, and you might have some adhesion issues if you don't fix the soft pastel. All right. Okay, let me clean off my gloves. I have a lot of purple on me now. And then we'll go in and start adding some oil pastel to our piece. Now, like I said, when you're adding oil pastel to these final layers, that oil pastel is going to have more of a presence. It's going to have a lot more texture. And there is that potential, if you didn't fix it well enough, to have a little bit of an oil bloom. So making sure that you focus the oil pastel from here down, where it's mostly in the foreground, that's really going to benefit the perspective and allowing the texture to be seen where you want it to be seen. Now, the furthest back I'm going to go when it comes to oil pastel is I really want to have those waves pop. That white is pretty soft. I want to kind of make it a little bit punchier by adding some oil pastel to that section, but I don't want to add straight white right away. So instead, I have a light gray, and I have a light blue and a light purple. So these are going to be what I use for those waves in the background, and then maybe I'll go back in and add tiny little touches of white. I don't want to draw attention to that over my pelican. So adding straight white to something that far back is going to be a little confusing in terms of perspective. So let me start adding some of this in. And just like the soft pastel, we want to kind of allow this to get into the crevice of the texture of the paper. So once I lay down something, I am going to be using my color shifters to kind of press it into the surface and move it around and give it a little bit more shape. We have another question?
Yes. Helen was wondering if you could substitute new pastels or hard pastels instead of pastel pencils in this?
I think so. I think the only difference is the usability. So yeah, I think you could definitely do that. All right. I'm gonna add a little bit of this purple back here too, just in some of these little areas. And then I think I want blue. Let me clean this off. Blue over here. I feel kind of like a makeup artist where I'm like using my glove. You can use the color shifters to move things around. You can also use those blending stumps that we were using with the soft pastels. Keep in mind though that if you do use a blending stump for the oil pastel, it is now only for oil pastel. So once you're done with that one, you can either only use it for oil pastel or you'll have to toss it. You can also kind of cut off the area that you used oil pastel and shave it in order to preserve it for something else. Now I'm going in with just the corner of my color shifter and creating that wave texture where it's kind of rolling over the shadow. And that's going to create a really nice physical texture. And it's not super vibrant, so it's not pulling your attention, but it is creating a little bit more texture to that wave. I am going to go in with just a couple touches of white because, I don't know, I feel like it needs a little bit more contrast. I might just add it here in just a couple areas. Okay. Go back in with the corner of my color shaper, add that nice wave texture again. And then I think that wave is done. It stands out a little bit more, it's not too distracting, it's got really nice texture. Now I'm not going any further back than that when it comes to oil pastel. Now I'm going to be moving forward. I'm going to do the same thing using these same 4 colors to bring out those bright areas of the white foam hitting the beach. Making sure I don't have anything on there. Be careful with this section, because if you are starting to blend oil pastel into the soft pastel, it will darken that soft pastel. So try not to blend too much. You want just those stark, solid areas of detail. And I never like to start with just straight white, even if it is pure white. All right, I'm just going to kind of scumble it down, make sure it's sticking to the surface. And maybe pulling it a little bit, that creates really nice texture. All right, and that was just with that gray. I have not added any white yet. I'm just blocking this down. And then we get the really nice foam that hits the beach. I actually don't, I think that gray might be too bright. I might have to go with this blue instead. I think I like that better. I might even add some purple. I feel like it might be a little bit darker. All right, let's blend that in. I'm going to smooth it out a little bit after that. Okay. I might add a couple extra touches of this, just a couple dots here and there. All right, and then lastly, some of these little waves up here need that bright white, especially since I added some back here on those waves. Going to just pull a couple little dots in here. And then I'll blend it out into the gray. Okay. Actually, I have a curved, kind of like a deer foot. That might work better for this step. And I don't want to add too much of this to the waves, so that might be where I stop. I did darken this area with oil pastel in my other piece, which I wasn't sure if I loved. I'm going to move on to the pelican, and I'll show you side by side. You tell me if you would like me to add that oil pastel to the foreground. So this right here I darkened with oil pastel, and this is without the oil pastel. So if you think I need to add a little bit more of darkness with the oil pastel in that section, please comment and Amanda will let me know. I am going to move on to the pelican in the meantime. All right, so for the pelican, let me put these guys away. For the pelican, I'm going to try and use a wider variety of colors, so I have some really nice variation of the feathers. I think I'm going to start with the beak and the feet so that when I do the feathers I can overlap those a little bit. So let's see, I have kind of like this reddish brown. I need that dark blue. Let me see. This one works. And then I also need kind of like a mid-tone blue, I think. I think I like this for those highlights. It's a little bit brighter, but once I mix it in with that darker blue, I think that'll be perfect. And then maybe just an extra highlight color for both the beak and the feet. I think this will be really nice for just tiny little areas of highlight for the feet. I keep going to wipe my face with the back of my hand. Oh my gosh. And then I think there's more of like a warm highlight on the beak. So like that brown area is highlighted. So I think I'm going to use this. So let's go ahead and start blocking that in. Now this is small and this is really thick. So I'm just going to lay this in the best I can, and then I'll move it around and blend it in with the blending stump and that color shifter. I'm going to stay away from the edges because I can always push it towards the edges. It's harder to pull back, especially with this, because once you go beyond those lines, it's a lot harder to cover up. So now I'm just using this to kind of push it into the places it needs to go to fit that shape. Let me see if I can get, I have a little bit of a crispy edge on here. I want just a touch of this on the end of the beak, and I'll blend it in with that dirty side of my stump. Creates a really nice neutralized purple, which I feel like fits with the colors in here. bit more. There's a little bit of a curve to the end of his beak. Let's get, I don't want to start with the darkest blue on this area. I would much rather block it in with this lighter blue and then add in the line work with that darker blue. Now I am covering up the eye. I know where it is going to go though, so I'm not too worried about that step. All right, so now I'm going to go in and try and get those really fine lines with my pastel here. Now I can use my accurate blade, create more of a point. I can also pick that piece up with my color shifters and apply it that way. But I'm just going to give myself a little bit of a point to work with to help make those lines. So now I've given myself kind of like a little bit of a few sharp edges to work with. And there's a line that goes from here to here. A little bit of darkness and a little bit of a fold there. And I'm not putting a lot of pressure, I'm just kind of gliding it into the place that I want it. It's a lot easier to lay down the line and it be too thick and then thin it down with the surrounding colors than it is to try and get that perfect thin line right off the bat.
Michaela, just as a spoiler,
Yeah.
we do want you to show us that shadow trick.
All right. And when you say shadow trick, do you mean the shadow under the foam that I created or adding the pastel to the water, like the thin water? Just as a clarification.
Yes.
Okay. I will do both.
Okay.
All right, and then let me just add a couple highlights. And then I think I'm good with this guy's beak. All right. Let's add the shadows in the water here, and then I'll also show you how I got that kind of oil stained shadow as well. So the two colors I used, I believe, are these two. They're like really nice neutralized sandy purples, which is like the perfect color that I needed for that area. So I'm going to go in and be very careful because, like I said, it's really hard to blend oil pastel into soft pastel without getting that, that oil mark. So I'm going to blend by lightly layering it into where I want it to blend, and then I can start laying it down. So I just filled this whole area here, which I'm just going to cover up those light spots and add them later. And then I'm going to, let me make sure I have a clean edge here. I'm not going to blend this area because that's going to turn this pretty seafoam color darker. I'm going to start further down here after the blend, like the dry brushing blend that I did. And then I'll fill this in here, making sure I get this dark color right underneath that bright white highlight. And then I'm going to lighten it with this color, which is slightly more sandy than that darker purple. And I'm just paying attention to where that darkness kind of subsides into the sand color. And then I can blend those together. I can blend the oil pastel into more oil pastel. It's harder to do that with it on top of the soft pastel. Now you can, I have done this as well, you can purposely have some oil pastel on your blending stump and go into a soft pastel area to create a shadow by simply adding oil to that area. Now this seems a little stark for my liking, so I might try grabbing a transition color in oil pastel that's a little bit closer to that sea foam. Maybe I'll use some of this light blue and just lightly brush that over this area to create a better transition. And that worked perfectly. Let me blend this bottom part in. All right. And that is what I did for that section. It just gives it a little bit more depth. It kind of makes it feel like you can see sand through the water now. I could do more up here if I wanted to, but that's just smaller areas and I want to make sure I get this completed. So let me show you how I did that oil shadow. Now what you're going to need is you're going to need fresh pastel in that area. So I used this purple to kind of create a little bit of a coolness in the sand. You need fresh pastel that's not fixed. So I'm just going to go back in to these areas. And add some fresh pastel. You can already see I colored in this little hole here and it had some oil pastel in there and it already went that darker purple than everything else. Oh, I think I just touched my black pants with the back of my glove. All right, I'm gonna blend this out so it's not like a stark line. Again, using that angle of the horizon line so it makes sense. Now that I have fresh unfixed pastel there, anytime I put a thick layer of oil pastel on top of it, that oil is going to leach into that soft pastel and create a little bit of a shadow. So I think I'm going to use the same thing here and start overlapping it just a touch. And I don't think it happens right away, so I might have to let it sit a little bit. But yep, it's starting to create a little bit of a shadow, not just from the physical texture, but that oil is starting to seep into that fresh pastel and create an actual oil bloom shadow. So even if you make mistakes, you can learn from them and utilize them in future projects. All right. Now we'll let that kind of create that shadow over time, and I'm going to focus back on those feet. So I'm just going to fill in the whole thing, I think, with this mid blue. I'm not worrying about getting all the way to the edges. That's what my blending stump is for. And I will say that the feathers, the next step, is really fun because you don't have to copy each feather like completely. You can kind of get kind of fun with it. You can find a repeating texture pattern and then just kind of fill it in and make it feel like a group of feathers. You can be a little bit more loose with your application, I guess. All right. I can hear the cicadas. All right, let me go in with this darker blue now, create those shadows. I need some right underneath the feathers there. I forgot I have a really crispy line there, so that was perfect. His ankle is a little bit darker. Same with this one. And then his little toes in between the webbing, those have some darkness. Let me get the bottom edge of his foot and his toes. He's also got tiny little nails, which I'm not going to try and do with the actual oil pastel. Again, I have this blending stump. Once I have plenty of oil pastel on this blending stump, I can probably just color it in with this tool. Perfect. Get his little nails in. Do you think other animals ever wish that they could paint their nails? Probably not, but a girl can dream. Okay. So I am going to go in and kind of sgraffito/blend using a pastel. I want the edges of his feet to feel a little bit crispier, and I want more of a shadow. So I'm just going to go in. This is the shadow color I used earlier, and I'm just going to follow along the edges with this to crisp up that line and create more of a shadow there. You can also use this to separate his 2 feet. They're kind of overlapping a little bit. All right, that feels better. Now remember what I said, if you ever use your soft pastels and you scrape into your oil pastel, either do it as soon as you're done or save all of the pastels that you use off to the side and clean them all when you're done. But I'm just going to shave off the area that I used on this piece. I'm even chopping off the tip just to be safe. And now this is ready to use for a future project. I don't have to worry about that oil on the tip. All right. I feel like I need more dimension in the feet. I forgot I have the feet highlight. Okay. So I'm just going to, I might have to cut a little bit of a point on here. And I'm just going to very lightly, he's got a little bit of a highlight in between the webbing of his toes. And it's a little bit lighter over here. A little bit there. Trying to be very sparing with this color. Then I'm going to blend it in just a little bit in some of these areas. All right, now that feels a lot better. His feet are done. I'm now going to move on to his feathers, and that will be the finishing step of this piece. So let's go ahead and jump in. Now, if I want to do sgraffito for his feathers up here, I do want to start with a lighter color and then layer a darker color on top. So when I scrape away that dark color, I see a lighter color. So the lightest color that I see in his feathers is actually like this kind of neon orange. So let me start blocking some of this in. It's going to look a little crazy, but bear with me. This whole strip of feathers here has some bright orange highlights, especially up here where his little, what was that, his wrist maybe? Where his wrist is. And then a little bit back here. And then all over his back, he's got really bright feather highlights. Same with that transition between that red and the tan of his feathers. And then just a little bit up there. He also has a little bit of a highlight halo around him. And then right where his ear is, there's a little bit of a lightness there. Okay, I'm gonna blend this in. Make sure it's actually down into the surface of the paper so that when I sgraffito, that is the color that pokes through. Now, if I had done this with the soft pastel step, I would not have to do this step. I could have done his entire body in this bright orange and then gone on top with just the darker colors and then pulled out the sgraffito that way. You have options. Make sure I get that crispy edge on his head there. Okay. So now I can go in with more of a mid-tone. So I think, is there something between this and that orange? Kind of. We could use this and then go on top with this. I think that's what we're gonna do. All right. I'm gonna fill in the rest of this area with this color. Probably not gonna do it down there. That's really dark down there. Maybe just a little bit. All right. Careful with those edges. You don't want to go out of the lines. I might need some of this down on his chest, so I'm just going to bring a little bit of this down here. And before I go too crazy with that color on his chest, I am going to do a really light color on his chest. So I don't think the light color I put down with the soft pastel is quite light enough. All right, let's blend that in. I am starting, since I'm using the same blending stump, I'm starting with the lighter color. And then I'm going to go in with the rest of that other color. And this poor blending stump, I've like kind of bent him a little bit. All right. I'm just making sure at this point that all the pastel I laid down, I don't have any like big, boogers, I guess, sticking out. I want to make sure it's all blended down before I move on to this next step. Okay, so now this is the prominent color all over him. I don't want to go too crazy with this, but I am going to start laying this down, following the direction of where his feathers are going. And blend that down. And then I'll start going darker and darker until I'm ready to start adding the details. And that's going to be where I bring in the sgraffito and those final touches. So that really dark area, there are some shadows that go almost blue. So I'm going to lay those down with the same blue I used in his beak. There's a little bit right here where it separates the his wing from his back on both sides. And then he starts getting some darkness on his wing here, especially down here. Where he's got kind of like a shadow of layered feathers here. And I'm also going to go in with this super dark brown. And I'm going to use this in a way where it's kind of like the feathers. I'm placing it down and then flicking it up in the direction of the feathers. Up here they kind of curve over the top. Now already that's looking like feathers. I can go a step further, calm down the texture by blending it in a little bit. And then I can go in with my sgraffito technique. Now you can use the color shifters. If that's not hard enough, you can use the back of it. You can also use these guys, which I'm going to be using just because I have a sharp enough point, and if that underlying orange wasn't enough, this might leave a little bit of that behind. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to find those prominent feathers and pull them out, especially down here where I have that darkness. I want to create a little bit more contrast. And that sgraffito is creating really beautiful feathers without having to paint in every single one. There's a couple little ones back here. All right, and then again, like I said, make sure you clean off your pastel once you're done with that. I think that wing is done. I think that turned out really well. All right, that guy is clean. Let's focus on the rest of the body, put in his eye and do his chest, and then we're done with this piece. All right, we're gonna do the same thing. I think we have this dark brown to fill in a couple areas. It gets really dark in here. Now, if you can see my reference photo, he's got a little bit of a mohawk going on the top of his head. So once I get to that area, I can do a couple of things. I can push this out at the angle of the kind of spiky mohawk using my blending stump. I could use my color shifters, or I can just create a kind of fuzzy edge and then go in with another one of these. So you have options for that. I think I'm going to do a little bit of all of them. So this is with the blending stump. I'm just kind of barely breaking that edge at the angle of his little furry mohawk. And then I'm going to go ahead and blend in the rest of this. I'm trying to be kind of loose with how I blend this so it looks more textured. As long as I do everything in the right direction, it will make sense. Okay, that looks good. Bring that darkness right up next to that bright orange highlight on his wing there. He's got a little bit of feathers coming out here too, so I'm going to do the same thing. All right. And now I'm going to do a couple sgraffito marks on his back. Wrong color. I want to use this guy. And then he's got a little bit of a highlight right here. I want to make sure I separate that wing. And then maybe just a little bit along his beak line to separate that. All right, I think I'm pretty happy with that. Let me just soften some of these edges. And smooth down some of those boogies. Just using my finger for that. All right, I'm gonna sharpen some of his little mohawk strands by using my little color shaper here to create some finer lines. Alright, and then maybe just a little bit more using this guy as the final. I think that's how it looks, right? Yeah. I need to remember to clean these two. Add just a touch more of that orange up there. Pop in his eye. Let's see. I might just use black for his eye, just so it stands out a little bit more. Going to pop in just the tiniest little black dot and highlight it just a touch with a lighter color so you can see it more. And blend that in. All right. I think at this point I could call this done. I can always keep kind of messing around with it. Always remember, if you do this, clean your soft pastels when you're done. Either shave off that oil or just cut off the point and resharpen it. Always remember to clean your oil pastels as well. Make sure there's no excess color on there so they're ready to go once you start working again. And I will do all of that off camera. These guys, if you use oil pastels for this, you're going to either want to cut off those tips and resharpen it, or only use it for oil pastel. Remember to clean your transition brushes. These guys you can just kind of rub on a piece of paper towel until it comes out clean. And these color shifters you can just wipe off with a paper towel as well. You want to be very clean with this. I know I got a little bit crazy on the table here, but make sure you treat your supplies with care so you can use them again later. But instead of peeling off the tape on that one, I'm just going to bring out this guy It's a little bit faster. I did things a little bit differently on this, but I think I like my pelican color choices on the other one. Let's actually look at those side by side. I do like the Sgraffito more on this guy. I think he feels a lot more realistic. I could have gone in and done more on his belly, which I don't think I did. I do like his belly on here more, but that is how I combined these two kind of opposite pastel mediums. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you try it yourself. As always, thank you so much for joining us for these Jerry's Live workshops. We really enjoy having you guys here. And we hope to see you next time. We have a show with Emmy and a special guest going over Liquitex markers. So join us next week if you are curious about those. And we'll see you next time.